welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are tackling some, well, incredibly challenging source material. It's quite possibly the most difficult study we've ever looked at.
It really is.
It's a very dense, very detailed academic paper by Professor Girma Berhanu, and it documents what can only be described as a staggering humanitarian and human rights emergency in Ethiopia's Amhara region.
Yeah, the material is extremely sensitive, and I think its gravity just demands our full attention, This isn't just a list of terrible events.
No.
The study tries to build a structural framework around conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence, SGBV, and it does this using some pretty specialized academic ideas like biopolitics and necropolitics.
Which we'll definitely unpack.
Absolutely. And our role here, just to be crystal clear for everyone listening, is absolute impartiality. We are here only to extract and synthesize the key evidence, the structural arguments, and those specific theoretical frameworks Professor Berhanu uses. Nothing more, nothing less, just what's in this source.
That really is the core mission today. Because even just looking at the abstract, the scale of the crisis is it's lean bare. The author talks about escalating atrocities, things that allegedly go way beyond previously known patterns of brutality in this conflict.
Yeah, way beyond.
We're talking about systematic SGBV, intentional acts designed specifically to inflict the most profound physical harm, but also psychological harm imaginable. The source is very clear that this violence is framed as a deliberate instrument of terror, used to destabilize society.
And Professor Berhanu points out right at the start the kind of global silence around these specific events. Despite the, detailed severity of the documented crimes, including mass killings and this unique horror of systematic mutilation, international awareness, international condemnation, it's described as disproportionately limited.
That gap is stark.
It really is. This gap between, say, the theoretical commitment we all have to human rights and the actual practical engagement with this specific crisis, that's a central critique in the paper.
It makes you think about whose suffering gets seen, right?
Yeah.
And who decides which victims are visible. Before we dive into the structure and the theory, we just have to acknowledge the initial facts that make this deep dive so necessary. The atrocities documented are specific, they're systematic, and frankly, they're gruesome.
They
include widespread killings, often accompanied by the severing of breasts and genital mutilation. And it's crucial, as the source points out, that these acts are reported to target young women, young girls, and men, too.
That's a critical point.
It shows it's not just a weapon targeting one gender. It's presented as this comprehensive assault on the biological and social integrity of an entire group.
Yeah, and I think that sets the necessary, if very somber, tone for us to properly unpack the evidence and the analytical tools the author uses to try and make sense of this.
Okay, let's try and unpack this claimed escalation. The source really starts by saying the situation is dramatically deteriorated. It's moved past previously documented patterns. The brutality is described as a significant and deeply troubling change in how the war is being fought, surpassing what was known before.
Right.
What specific evidence does the author actually provide to back up this claim, this idea of a dangerous escalation?
Well, the evidence seems to hinge on two main things: the sheer nature of the violence itself, and then, crucially, the alleged perpetrators.
Yeah.
The source is very explicit. It attributes these newly alleged extreme crimes primarily to the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, the ENDF, and also specific identifiable elements within the Oromo Special Forces.
That's a really important distinction, isn't it?
It's crucial because it suggests state-aligned forces aren't just, involved peripherally. They're allegedly orchestrating and executing these severe violations. It kind of removes the defense that these might just be rogue actors acting alone.
Right. The source frames it as potentially systemic, part of a strategy.
Exactly, a systemic strategy.
And when we look at the specific patterns of SGBV reported, the details are, as we said, difficult, but they're necessary if we want to understand the scale of the calculated cruelty described. Can you walk us through that spectrum of violence? What's detailed from witnesses and corroborated sources?
Yeah, it's grim. The source documents this spectrum of systematic physical violence that really suggests a kind of deliberate strategic sadism. It seems designed to maximize not just immediate pain, but long-term suffering and public terror.
So what does that look like specifically?
Well, there are reports of violent rape, often accompanied by severe physical trauma, things like beatings, stabbings, even burning. And in some of the most horrifying accounts the author cites, perpetrators allegedly used foreign objects during assaults. causing severe and likely irreparable genital injuries.
And this is paired, crucially, with that specific act mentioned earlier, forced breast amputation.
Exactly. That's cited as a specific systematic attack method, and it's coupled with executions which are then followed by the public display of the bodies.
The public display.
Yes, and the author meticulously emphasizes this isn't random. It's far from random. It's explicitly intended, the source argues, to terrorize and subjugate entire communities. The bodies essentially become these morbid public billboards, broadcasting a message of absolute control, maximizing psychological damage across the whole targeted population.
That detail, the strategic use of public display that feels critical. It suggests the goal isn't just killing people. It's about governing through sheer fear.
Precisely.
And this brings us straight to the systematic targeting, the intent behind it all. Who are the primary targets identified in the study?
The source highlights that adolescents and young women are systematically targeted. And when you analyze the specific acts of mutilation, the breast and genital severing, the author connects this directly to their powerful symbolic and functional purpose. It's meant to be more than just immediate torture.
Okay, so what's the symbolic attack here, according to the source? Why target these specific parts of the body?
It's presented as a targeted strike against the reproductive capacity, against the perceived vitality of the ethnic group itself, by attacking womanhood, motherhood, the potential for future generations. These acts inflict lasting physical and psychological harm that just radiates outwards, far beyond the individual victim.
It's not just about the individual.
Not at all. They impose this deep, maybe ineradicable stigma on the victim, and by extension, that fractures the cohesion of the entire community. The victim's body is deliberately used as a political weapon. It's transformed into this message of vulnerability and physical destruction, delivered to the entire ethnic group.
Wow.
And this aligns chillingly with that concept we'll discuss later, a necropolitical act, where the body is made disposable, strategically destroyed.
It sounds like a mechanism designed for long-term social destruction. And the source doesn't stop at just documenting the physical violence. It also details systematic, seemingly institutional efforts to silence witnesses, which speaks volumes about the alleged state involvement, doesn't it?
Absolutely. This is where the challenges in documenting these crimes actually become part of the crime itself. The source highlights active efforts at intimidation and suppression.
How so?
Well, it reports that families of the mutilated and murdered girls have themselves been subjected to detention, to intimidation. This isn't just, passive neglect of an investigation. It's presented as an active structural effort by security forces to obstruct the truth from coming out.
And there was that specific example mentioned in the outline about a father.
Yes. That's a critical detail the source verifies, an instance where a father was allegedly coerced into publicly denying that he witnessed his own daughter's injuries.
That's chilling. It shows the strategy isn't just physical violence, it's the active, potentially state-sponsored destruction of truth itself. Can you give any more details on these suppression efforts?
The source cites specific examples where security forces apparently warned relatives point blank, do not disclose information to foreign observers or media outlets. And that verified instance of the father being allegedly coerced into a public denial. It just demonstrates the depth of control being asserted over the narrative.
So the trauma is doubled.
Exactly. Victims suffer the atrocity, and then their families are forced into silence, which prevents not only justice, but also even the solace of collective mourning, of remembrance. The system, as described, seems designed to enforce forgetting.
And all of this SGBV, this horrific violence, is allegedly happening alongside other forms of violence, suggesting a coordinated campaign.
That's what the source argues. It notes these violations coincide with ongoing drone strikes against civilian populations, including, reportedly, specifically targeting survivors of sexual violence.
Targeting survivors.
That's the claim. It suggests a coordinated, multi-layered campaign against non-combatants. You have the high-tech, remote violence of military drones paired with this systematic, intimate, personal violence and mutilation.
And civilians.
Consistently non-combatants, often in their homes or even places of worship. This coordination, this layering of violence, speaks strongly to the author's conclusion that this is, or appears to be, a deliberate strategy of terror.
And finally, how does the author frame these patterns legally within international law?
The author's legal analysis is quite unambiguous. These patterns are described as entirely consistent with war crimes and crimes against humanity, specifically encompassing systematic sexual violence, torture, and extrajudicial executions. Furthermore, the systematic nature of the targeting is argued to violate key international treaties, like CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women.
So the source isn't framing this as just isolated criminal behavior.
No, definitely not. It's presented as a strategic deployment of extreme violence targeted across ethnic and gender lines and demanding, in the author's view, serious international legal scrutiny. Yeah, and to really bring this home, to move from the statistics and the legal frameworks to the human reality, the author centers the entire study around a critical case, the life and death of a young woman named Bealem Wasse.
Her story is presented as the emotional and moral core of the study.
It really is.
Let's dedicate the time needed to her profile, as it's so meticulously detailed in the source. Bealem Wasse. She was 19 years old, described as incredibly active, curious, ambitious, passionate about arts and sciences. But instead of starting ninth grade a couple of years prior, she made this just wrenching decision. She joined the Federal Resistance Movement. The source quotes people who knew her, remembering her courage, her respectfulness, her deep drive to learn.
And the tragic details of the trauma she endured, verifiable trauma, the source stresses as a wounded prisoner of war. They are absolutely paramount to the author's argument about identity-based violence.
What happened to her?
Her breast was severed, which is in itself a profound act of gender-specific violence. But the source highlights another detail, a detail that moves the act beyond sheer brutality into something else, into a specific, what the author calls a necropolitical assertion of dominance.
What was that?
The skin bearing her tattoo, a tattoo that read, "I am Amhara," was reportedly flayed from her hand.
Flayed from her hand. That detail is just chilling. It transforms the atrocity, doesn't it, from physical injury into this deliberate attempt at symbolic erasure. The violence isn't just aimed at her body, but at the identity marked right there on her skin.
Precisely. That's exactly the point the author uses this instance to make, arguing that this is an act intended to inflict permanent collective trauma, to signify the deliberate, potentially state-aligned erasure of ethnic identity. This moves the violence beyond physical injury into a truly necropolitical act, an attempt to destroy the subject's very political existence by erasing the symbols of their belonging.
And then her body?
She was reportedly left exposed and her body publicly displayed, reinforcing that message of disposability to the entire community.
Does the source have confirmation for this account? It's incredibly specific.
Yes. The documentation relies heavily on the testimony of a Fano leader named Anadis Walain. She's identified as a female member, or Fonet, affiliated with the Teledros Command.
And she agreed to be named.
She consented to be identified by name, yes. And she provided extensive details about the brutality Bealem suffered. Crucially, she specifically attributed these acts to elements of the Oromo Special Forces. That's a vital element of verification in this context. Named witnesses operating under what must be extreme personal risk.
We really need to understand why. Why would a young, ambitious woman like Bealem choose this path? Armed resistance instead of education.
Yeah, the source details that her motivation apparently stemmed from her just absolute inability to tolerate the systematic violence and persecution she saw the Amhara community facing. It wasn't a career choice, you know?
Yeah.
It's presented as a moral imperative, something born out of sheer desperation.
Fueled by what specifically?
Fueled by the kind of systematic targeting of civilians we just discussed. Repeated drone strikes on civilian gatherings, the burning of villages, the constant bombardment of churches, mass executions. And the source emphasizes her deep frustration with what she perceived as government indifference, total indifference.
The source mentions a stark contrast.
Yes, the author points out this jarring contrast. As massacres were allegedly continuing, official state attention often shifted dramatically, focusing on symbolic public relations events like these large-scale tree planting campaigns.
Tree planting?
Yes, which were viewed by many citizens, according to the source, as cynical, hollow gestures that just masked institutional failure or even complicity.
It is jarring to read that. Mass executions on one hand, a high-profile tree planting campaign on the other. The author seems to be suggesting that this performance, this PR, and the neglect are two sides of the same political mask, and Bealem saw through it.
That seems to be the implication. Her reported questioning, where is God when my people suffer like this? It reflects this overwhelming moral and emotional toll that prolonged violence and impunity were inflicting on her generation. Her decision to join Fano was reportedly rooted right there in this desperate sense of moral duty.
Which brings us to how the source actually defines the Fano movement itself. How is it described?
According to the author, Fano emerged specifically as a grassroots movement, self-organized, a direct response to systematic injustice. It's described as embodying not just a military stance, but an intellectual and moral stance against what the author terms ethnic fascism, narrow nationalism, apartheid-like policies, internal colonialism, and the kind of pseudo-legal political corruption they see permeating the government structure.
So the author frames it not just as fighters, but as this political and intellectual expression of civic responsibility
Yeah.
and Ethiopian patriotism.
Exactly. The source really emphasizes its ground-level roots. It's described as an unpaid, under-resourced, self-armed volunteer defense group. Its stated mission, according to the author, is protecting the Amhara people from annihilation and, importantly, upholding the integrity of Ethiopian unity.
And they connect themselves to history.
Yes, they explicitly link themselves to the historical Fano resistance against the Italian occupation back in the 1930s. The author emphasizes that their reputation, as presented in the source, is grounded not in seeking glory or conquest, but solely in the defense of their community and heritage.
The source even includes excerpts of Amharic poetry, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Which speaks to this deep cultural tie to resistance and remembrance.
It does, and that highlights the cultural effort being made to honor Bealem's heroism and the sacrifices of other Fano fighters, to ensure her legacy is marked by commemoration, by memory. The author states quite plainly that future generations must be assured that the sacrifices of young heroes like her are honored through public celebration and cultural memory.
It's clear the author views Bealem as an unsung national hero, someone whose spirit was tragically extinguished by alleged state-aligned violence, but whose life marked by moral conviction, by resilience, remains this powerful testament to the necessity of fighting for justice when faced with systematic abuse.
Absolutely. Her story isn't just a case study in the paper. It serves as a kind of rallying cry within the source material itself.
Okay, so we've established the evidence presented, the patterns, and the profound human cost through Bealem Wasse's story. Now we need to shift into the deep analytical frameworks Professor Berhanu uses to make sense of it all. He links these specific atrocities to modern political thought, using Michel Foucault's biopolitics and Achille Mbembe's necropolitics. These are big concepts. Let's start with Foucault's biopolitics. Can you define that clearly for us?
Sure. So Foucault's concept describes what he saw as this huge shift in how power gets exercised, particularly in the modern age, say from the 17th century onwards. Power moves away from the classical sovereign's right, which was traditionally to take life or let live, the power of the sword.
Right, the power to execute.
Exactly. It moves to a new paradigm, to make, live, and let die.
Okay, make, live, and let die. So modern governance isn't primarily focused on punishing or killing individuals anymore, but on administering life itself, managing life.
Precisely. Biopower is basically governance centered on the administration, the regulation, the optimization of biological existence, but primarily at the level of the population.
Like public health.
Exactly. Think of all the institutions we have that are dedicated to monitoring and managing things like birth rates, public health, sanitation, reproduction, longevity, overall demographic strength. The modern state works strategically to foster life, to discipline bodies, and manage populations for what it sees as optimal national strength and vitality.
So how does the source apply this idea of regulating and fostering life to the Amhara people, especially when the state's supposed function is to make live?
Right, and this is where the concept kind of gets turned on its head, or at least complicated. The author notes that critical observers have cited this profound and deeply concerning reduction in the Amhara population. The figure cited is approximately 7 million over 34 years.
7 million.
That's the figure cited in the source. And this massive number, according to the author, raises these intense biopolitical questions about the management and, crucially, the systematic neglect of life. When a state is supposedly engineered to optimize and foster life, but a huge segment of its population is declining or suffering systematic violence and displacement, well, the biopolitical function seems profoundly distorted.
It's like the state is making live for one group,
while actively letting die another, or perhaps worse.
And this inherent limitation, maybe, in Foucault's framework, the difficulty of explaining why a modern state would just let a major population decline like that, or worse, is that where Achille Mbembe's necropolitics comes in, as a necessary theoretical extension.
That's exactly right. Mbembe, drawing heavily on post-colonial critique, argues that Foucault's biopolitics doesn't quite capture the historical and, importantly, the contemporary realities of places dominated by colonial structures, by slavery, by ongoing racialized warfare.
So Foucault is too Eurocentric, perhaps.
Mbembe suggests that, yes. He contends that sovereignty, even today, still fundamentally hinges on the power to decide who must die. He defines necropolitics as the use of social and political power to deliberately expose certain populations to death, often through structural violence, rendering them politically insignificant, disposable.
And this leads to his idea of death worlds.
Exactly. These are zones. Historically, you could think of colonial plantations or concentration camps. Contemporaneously, maybe occupied territories or zones of intense civil conflict or areas of profound state neglect. Places where people are reduced to what Mbembe calls a state of living death.
Stripped of value.
Stripped of political value, legally abandoned, rendered disposable by the state apparatus itself. And the author explicitly states that few frameworks capture the systemic tragedy the Amhara people are allegedly enduring more poignantly than this concept. This idea of calculated disposability, that tattoo flaying we discussed earlier, that becomes a prime example of destroying the subject's political life even before the biological one.
Okay, so if biopolitics is about managing the vitality of the nation, necropolitics is about actively managing death or creating these differentiated zones where death is the expected, maybe even state-sanctioned outcome for specific populations.
Yes, it reveals the persistent colonial, ethno-racial underside of biopolitical modernity. The source argues that these two frameworks, biopolitics and necropolitics, deeply intersect in the Ethiopian context.
How so?
The argument is that the same state that invests in modern infrastructure, builds schools, funds hospitals, that's the biopolitical function, right? Making live that same state may simultaneously imprison, displace, or starve a specific population. Life management and death dealing are presented as deeply intertwined, as dual components of the current political rationality in Ethiopia, according to this analysis.
That's a disturbing thought. What are the specific, maybe more structural, necropolitical mechanisms the source identifies, beyond the direct military action and violence we've discussed?
The source highlights two primary structural mechanisms that are argued to operate at this necropolitical level. First, famine.
Famine as a political tool.
Yes. The author argues quite convincingly, I think, that historically recurring famines in Ethiopia are not merely random natural disasters. They are profound political phenomena. Decisions about resource allocation, about market access, about the strategic visibility of suffering, like who gets acknowledged as starving and who gets ignored, those decisions determine who lives and who dies.
So inaction becomes action.
Calculated inaction, perhaps. In the author's view, state action, or this calculated inaction, allows certain populations, particularly in remote Amhara, Afar, and Somali areas, to perish. It embodies Mbembe's politics of death through resource denial and a kind of legal abandonment.
Okay, that's famine. What was the second mechanism? It related to the political structure itself.
Yes. Ethnic federalism. This is maybe the most intellectually complex application in the source.
How does that work?
The author argues that Ethiopia's constitutional system of ethnic federalism, which was introduced back in the early 1990s, has systematically created differentiated forms of citizenship and, crucially, zones of abandonment.
By design.
The argument is that by establishing regions based primarily on ethnicity, it structurally empowers certain groups while marginalizing others within those same regions or across the country. Peripheral regions like Afar, Somali, Gambela, and Benishangul-Gumuz are cited as examples of these potential death worlds, places where life is structurally precarious, justice is often absent, and the state's presence is primarily militarized and extractive, rather than supportive.
Can you elaborate a bit on how the source claims this political structure systematically creates these zones of, like, de jure abandonment, legal abandonment almost?
Well, the argument presented is that the structure itself can set up regional governments to fail, or even to actively discriminate. It can lead to denying equal access to justice, to security, to resources for non-dominant ethnic groups who live within those regional boundaries.
And the Amhara are often in that position.
Amharas are cited as the largest group often targeted in this way, particularly those living in the Oromia region. So the system itself, according to the source, formalizes this uneven valuation of human life based on ethnicity, which is the very essence of necropolitics operating structurally. It moves the discussion beyond just conflict into understanding these deeper systemic mechanisms of how modern power operates, governing not just territory, but the very existence, the very value of different groups within the state.
To really grasp the intensity and the specific nature of the current violence described, the source says we need to delve into historical context, particularly around the practice of body mutilation and also the roots of the contemporary political hatred that seems to be fueling this.
Yes, the author raises an extremely sensitive point, but one deemed essential for context. Historical records apparently suggest that body mutilation was, at one time, part of initiation rites and warfare practices in certain Oromo cultural contexts.
Okay.
The source notes that severed body parts were sometimes displayed as sort of proof of a deed in a warrior ethos. A practice, it should be said, that was common in many historical conquest cultures around the world, not unique to this context.
But this historical context is raised specifically to draw a stark contrast with modern state practice, right? How did this change historically in Ethiopia?
Right. The source notes that during the reign of Emperor Menelik II, these kinds of practices, along with slavery, were gradually and systematically outlawed across the Ethiopian empire.
So the state actively suppressed it.
Yes. The author highlights that Menelik's resolve was apparently tested with some regional leaders who refused to comply. He reportedly compelled powerful figures, like Negus Tona of Wolaita, to abdicate because Tona refused to abolish slavery and other customs deemed inhumane.
Wow.
The prohibition was apparently so significant that it led to the cultural replacement of using real body parts with using a symbolic wooden object known as the kalecha, which is mentioned in the source as a cultural artifact that still exists today.
Okay, so the distinction the author is drawing here is critical. These historically outlawed practices, which might have once been rooted in conquest narratives, are allegedly being reactivated today. But crucially, they're now being reinforced by modern state institutions and military structures.
Precisely. That's the core argument. The logic of domination and exclusion, the source claims, has been reactivated within the modern political landscape. And, crucially, the source attributes the enforcement of this violence not to isolated cultural traditions reviving on their own, but to state-aligned forces, specifically naming Oromo-dominated divisions of the ENDF and the Oromia Special Forces.
So the mechanism of violence might have historical echoes.
But the institutional backing, the power structure enabling it, is modern and, allegedly, state-controlled.
And this ties directly into what the source presents as the driving ideological force behind the conflict. This ideology of anti-Amhara sentiment, or what the source actually terms Amharaphobia.
Yeah, this sentiment, the source explains, isn't new, not at all. It's apparently featured prominently in Ethiopian political discourse for nearly half a century, cultivated, the author argues, by successive regimes going back to the Derg era, and then amplified dramatically by ethno-nationalist movements after 1991.
And the core narrative is?
The narrative frames the Amhara as the historical oppressors, the Abyssinian colonialists.
The source specifically mentions Oromo nationalist ideologues, like Asafa Jalada, who built these foundational theoretical frameworks. What did those frameworks claim?
Well, they framed the Oromo people as victims of this colonial Abyssinian domination, and they sought to dismantle the Ethiopian state as it existed and establish a kind of greater Oromia free from what they perceived as Amhara cultural and political influence. The source presents this by impartially reporting the claim that Oromo nationalism uses these historical grievances to justify a modern political project.
But the author also expresses some skepticism about certain historical claims fueling this narrative, correct?
Yes, for balance, the source does question the historical plausibility of some specific claims. For instance, the idea that Menelik II committed genocide against the Oromo. The source points out that the estimated total population of Ethiopia back in the 1800s was likely fewer than 8 million people, making genocide on the scale sometimes claimed statistically improbable. However, the author stresses that regardless of the strict historical accuracy, these narratives have been undeniably effective, very influential in nurturing resentment toward the Amhara, casting them as the historical oppressor that needs to be neutralized today.
And the source argues that this deep-seated victimhood rhetoric has now allegedly evolved into something more dangerous.
Into an exclusionary and, at times, potentially genocidal ideology, that's the claim. What the author argues is the critical distinction now in the current conflict.
Yes.
The distinction is that this ideology is allegedly no longer confined to academic debates or political rallies. It's manifested on the ground, where elements of the Oromia Special Forces and ENDF divisions have allegedly not only tolerated extreme, often sadistic violence, but have actively participated directly in massacres and mutilation targeting ethnic Amharas. The ideology has gone from rhetoric to operational violence, according to the source.
And this leads, the source argues, to the institutionalizing of marginalization, asserting that the current administration, led by the ruling Prosperity Party, PP, and its Oromo leadership, is actively reinforcing this marginalization.
Yeah, the evidence cited for that includes things like official statements, restrictions on movement for Amharas, mass arrests of Amhara journalists and activists, and various discriminatory practices that reinforce this perception of systematic marginalization.
Why target the Amhara specifically, according to this analysis?
The author contends that the Amhara are perceived by elements within the ruling party as the primary obstacle to the political dominance sought by the PP, mostly due to their large demographic size, their significant cultural influence, and their historical role in state formation. This perception, the argument goes, makes them a calculated target of both direct state action and the failure of state protection, which again links right back to that idea of necropolitics, selective abandonment.
And the targeting isn't just physical bodies, displacement. It extends deep into culture and religion, too. Specifically, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, EOTC, which is central to Amhara identity for many.
Absolutely. The EOTC is this historic, generally monolithic institution. The source details two main strategic attacks on it. First, a political attempt to fragment the church along ethnic lines.
How?
Through the establishment of a breakaway synod, led primarily by Oromo clergy, the author views this as an attempt to undermine the church's national unity, reduce its influence, all under the guise of addressing supposed ethnic underrepresentation within the church hierarchy.
That's the political attack. What about physical attacks?
Yes. Second, there are reports cited of direct physical attacks, drone strikes, and artillery shelling against historic monasteries and churches. These attacks allegedly resulted in significant civilian casualties, monks, priests, worshippers,
Which suggests,
according to the source, a pattern of either deliberate or incredibly reckless attacks on essential religious and cultural heritage sites. This broadens the scope of the violence beyond immediate military objectives into the realm of cultural and historical destruction.
we should also touch upon the situation for non-Oromo populations living inside the Oromo region itself. The source estimates something like 15 million non-Oromos, mostly Amharas, live there under constant threat.
That's the estimate cited, yes. And they reportedly face harassment, displacement, detention. The source cites specific incidents of coordinated mob violence against Amhara, Guraj, and Gamo civilians, particularly in the aftermath of the killing of the popular Oromo singer Hachalu Hundessa back in 2020.
And the authorities' response.
This violence was allegedly compounded by the failure of authorities to prevent it or to respond effectively afterwards, deepening the non-Oromo population's sense of insecurity, of abandonment. It's presented as almost a perfect demonstration of necropolitical structural neglect within a zone of alleged ethnic control.
So the section really concludes with this dire assessment that ethnic hatred and exclusionary politics aren't just tools for mobilization anymore. They're being used, allegedly, as mechanisms of state control designed to achieve political dominance through fear and systematic marginalization.
It's really essential, I think, particularly for you listening, to understand the profound challenges Professor Berhanu and other investigators like him face in actually verifying these reports. This difficulty is absolutely central to understanding the impunity that the alleged perpetrators seem to enjoy.
Right, the constraints on documenting things in an active conflict zone are just immense. You can't just send in teams easily.
Yeah.
So comprehensive prevalence data, especially for highly sensitive acts like breast severing, genital mutilation, it remains extremely limited.
Very limited.
The source has to rely heavily on survivor testimony, on remote interviews, indirect evidence, rather than, say, large-scale, independently conducted forensic studies on the ground.
Exactly. And this limitation, the source is careful to clarify, isn't a suggestion that the acts are rare or didn't happen.
Wow.
Not at all.
It reflects the obstacles.
It reflects the deliberate obstacles that are inherent in this conflict zone. The author details several factors. You have the collapse or severe dysfunction of local health systems, which just destroys essential clinical record keeping.
Right.
You have the overwhelming fear, the stigma, the huge security risks that prevent survivors from speaking out, sometimes even years later. You have heavily restricted media access, restricted humanitarian access, and perhaps most critically, the source points to active government obstruction of independent investigators and forensic experts.
That obstruction point feels key. It implies that the difficulty in getting proof is actually part of the strategy, a tactic to enforce silence, maintain plausible deniability.
That's certainly the implication drawn. So when investigators, including the source author, Professor Berhanu, compile their findings, they're forced to rely heavily on these methods of indirect verification.
What does that look like in practice?
It means using remote interviews, often conducted via encrypted channels, apparently, relying on triangulating corroborated testimonies, trying to match stories across multiple independent local sources, human rights monitors, and crucially, using photographic evidence or limited medical documentation that might be provided by local health workers, people who are operating under immense personal danger themselves.
So the evidence is pieced together under extreme duress.
Exactly. It reflects a world where the state is allegedly actively trying to suppress the material truth of what's happening.
And the significance of these evidence gaps. It needs to be framed correctly, doesn't it? The author stresses quite forcefully that the absence of large-scale, court-ready, quantitative evidence doesn't mean the acts didn't occur.
No. It's presented as an indication of the active suppression of data collection and investigation within the conflict zone, and that suppression directly ensures impunity.
Which brings us back maybe one final time to the strategic nature of the mutilation described. The source reiterates its core analytical conclusion here, right?
It does, that the targeting of women's bodies and the bodies of young Fano fighters like Bealem Wasse, it's not incidental. It's not just the unfortunate result of random military misconduct or undisciplined soldiers. It is defined by the author as a deliberate strategy of terror.
A strategy aimed specifically at destroying community cohesion and the systematic erasure of ethnic identity.
Exactly. It serves these dual functions, according to the analysis. Symbolically, it attacks womanhood, motherhood, the group's perceived capacity for reproduction, and functionally, it inflicts lasting physical, psychological, and social harm, ultimately guaranteeing the fracture of communities, contributing to long-term collective trauma and displacement. The body becomes the ultimate enduring battleground, transforming individuals into these living, breathing reminders of the violence done to the entire group.
The analysis section then concludes with this really potent restatement of the urgent need for action, doesn't it?
Yes. The source calls for immediate, independent investigation into possible crimes against humanity, into ethnic persecution, and these attacks on cultural and religious heritage, all under international law. Without that kind of independent scrutiny, the source warns, the systematic violations will just continue in this climate of total impunity and active suppression. #outro.
We have now completed our deep dive into Professor Girma Berhanu's incredibly complex and, yes, extraordinarily difficult study. We reviewed the detailed evidence presented on systematic SGBV and mutilation in the Amhara region. We've tried to understand the profound human cost through the specific case study of Bealem Wasse, and we've explored those crucial theoretical frameworks, biopolitics and necropolitics, that the author uses to connect these alleged state-aligned actions to broader patterns of power.
And the relevance for you, the listener, I think, is really in recognizing how these frameworks help dismantle simplistic explanations of conflict. They allow us to see, or at least consider the argument, that power in modern states isn't solely about providing services or managing national vitality.
The making law.
Right. It can simultaneously manage life through hospitals, schools, infrastructure, while actively producing these differentiated zones of death and disposability for specific internal populations. Like the Amhara community, as described in this source, it's the political rationality of selective abandonment made visible.
We also noted the source's really profound concern that despite the severity of the crimes, detailed acts that, according to the author, meet the criteria for war crimes and crimes against humanity, international awareness and condemnation just remain disproportionately limited. The world's attention seems fragmented, selectively applied.
Which leads us right into the final provocative thought the author leaves us with, and the question of memory. The source notes that future generations must be assured that the sacrifices of young heroes like Bealem Wasse are honored through acts of remembrance, through commemoration.
And this raises, I think, a really powerful moral question for all of us who've absorbed this difficult material today. In a world where victims' families are systematically coerced into silence, where they're detained, pressured into publicly denying the truth of their loved one's suffering, where the state allegedly participates in the active suppression of documentation, what practical, meaningful role can global remembrance and documentation actually play? How can they ensure justice, especially when institutional and political accountability seems impossible, or at least very far off?
Yeah, what is the moral obligation of memory when political systems actively try to enforce forgetting? The documented violence, as presented here, is an attempt to erase an identity, to demoralize a population into political submission. So, the fight to document, the fight to remember, perhaps that becomes an essential act of resistance in itself. Maybe the only long-term act of resistance against necropolitics available to outsiders and to future generations.
A profound question to end on. Thank you for navigating this complex and truly necessary deep dive with us.